jellied chicken loaf, the cold cut that told a war-era love story. It jiggled, it gleamed, it dared you to try it, and it didn't care what you thought. Jellied chicken loaf was one of those dishes that sat proudly on the table, unapologetically weird, somehow elegant, and unmistakably from another era. To understand this recipe, you have to understand the time. There were no Costco rotisserie chickens, no deli counters with 50 sandwich meats lined up in glass cases. Meat was rationed, kitchens were hot, and people had learned the art of making food stretch, not with substitutes, but with style. This loaf wasn't just thrift, it was an invention born of control, a way to shape leftovers into something worthy of a tablecloth. It started with poached chicken, usually a whole bird, boiled until the meat was soft enough to shred with a fork. You didn't toss the bones. You simmered them down with carrot tops, celery ends, and bay leaves until you had a broth rich enough to float a spoon. That broth would become your base, your glue. You added unflavored gelatin, not the fruity kind, just the plain powder, to the warm broth and stirred until it dissolved into clarity. Next came the meat, shredded chicken, sometimes finely chopped carrots or peas for color, maybe a few celery bits or parsley if you wanted to get fancy. All of it gently folded into the cooled, thickened broth until it looked like something between a salad and a soup. Then you poured it into a loaf mold, glass or tin, and left it to chill overnight, tucked in the fridge beside a bowl of potato salad and a dish of canned pears. The next day, you'd turn it out with a careful hand, a cold, clear block of shimmering protein. Each slice, smooth, firm, and freckled with vegetables like confetti frozen in time. You'd lay it out on a plate with crisp lettuce leaves and serve it with a dollop of mayonnaise or a spoonful of mustard cream. And here's the thing, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't ironic. This was food that said, "We made it work." It was quiet pride molded into slices. No heat, no waste, no fuss. This dish didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It didn't try to be warm or cheesy or indulgent. It was honest, clean, refreshing in a time when fridges were still a luxury and cold meals were a blessing in July. You'd find jellied chicken loaf at luncheons, funeral receptions, and Sunday spreads when guests came by unexpectedly. It traveled well, held its shape, and looked like you'd put in more effort than you actually had. That was part of its charm. It was a trick of presentation, a lesson in how to stretch a single chicken across 5 days and still feel like you were eating something new. Kids looked at it sideways. Some adults did too, but those who knew, they knew what it stood for. Today, it's all but vanished. The word gelatin makes people flinch, but once upon a time it was the signature of a careful hand and a clever kitchen. It was a kind of culinary courage, one that didn't need applause, but still deserved respect, because jellied chicken loaf wasn't about indulgence. It was about dignity, a chilled slice of ingenuity on a plate that said, "We didn't waste, we fed everyone, and we did it with grace." Apple Brown Betty, the dessert that smelled like hope in a cold house. It wasn't a pie, it wasn't a crumble, it wasn't a cobbler, but it lived in the same drawer of memory, right next to them. The Apple Brown Betty didn't need a fancy name to leave a mark. It already had one that sounded like a character in a bedtime story, and maybe that's what it was. Not just a dessert, but a reminder that sweetness didn't require wealth, that comfort could come from crusts and scraps and the things most people threw away. Brown Betty was the dessert you made when there wasn't enough of anything else. Not enough flour for pie dough, not enough butter for cake, not enough sugar for cookies, but apples. Those you could find in the backyard, on the neighbor's tree, a paper sack from the farmer's market filled with bruised ones that didn't sell. And bread, always there, always aging quietly in the bread box, edges dry, crusts curled. You'd peel and slice the apples, thin so they'd bake evenly. Tart apples were best. Granny Smith or whatever grew from that gnarled tree behind the shed. Then you'd tear the bread into crumbs, not the neat kind from a food processor, but the kind made by hand, rubbed between fingers until it turned soft and uneven. In a baking dish, usually the one with the hairline crack on the corner, you'd start the layering: apples, crumbs, a sprinkle of brown sugar, a pat of butter, then again. No measuring, just instinct. A little cinnamon, maybe a touch of nutmeg if you were lucky. Then into the oven it went. That was the real beginning. The smell would creep out of the kitchen and wrap around the house like a warm blanket. Baked apples and butter and spice. You didn't need a timer. You just waited until the scent turned thick and deep, until it filled your lungs and your bones and made the hardest day feel like it was finally ending. When it came out, the top would be golden, the bottom soft and syrupy. You'd spoon it into chipped bowls, maybe with milk or cream or even just on its own. It wasn't neat, it wasn't pretty, but it was perfect, especially when eaten standing at the stove, still too hot, the steam curling up into your face. This was the dessert that showed up when you needed it most. On rainy Tuesdays, during war rations, after funerals, after layoffs, after long nights waiting for the phone to ring. It didn't announce itself like cake or demand celebration like pie. It whispered instead. Quiet comfort, warm from the inside out. And for many, it became tradition without ever being declared one. Mothers taught daughters. Grandfathers made it when no one else would. It didn't live on a recipe card. It lived in muscle memory. Today, Apple Brown Betty barely gets mentioned in cookbooks, but those who remember, they don't need a recipe. They just need apples and stale bread. And a reason, because sometimes the best desserts don't celebrate anything. They save you. They remind you that home isn't just a place. It's a smell, a spoonful, a quiet promise. We'll get through this, and there will be something warm waiting when we do. Beef heart stew, the meal that taught you strength could be tender. 2. It didn't look like the kind of meat you'd see in a butcher's window. It didn't come neatly sliced or marbled or shrink-wrapped in plastic. It was heavy, dense, pulled from the chest cavity of an animal whose every heartbeat echoed through the stew pot like a second chance. Beef heart stew wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated, but it was there, simmering on the stove when families needed something rich, something real, and something that could stretch across 6 plates with nothing but potatoes, thyme, and love. You started with the trimming. That was the hard part. Removing the sinew, the connective tissue, the veins that told you exactly what part of the animal you were working with. It took patience, a good knife, and someone who wasn't afraid of the truth, because this was food with a face, with weight, with purpose. Once cleaned, the heart was chopped into chunks, not too big, not too small. Then browned in a deep pot with onions and garlic until the smell filled the room with something bold and ancient. After that, you'd pour in the broth, beef stock, or even just water seasoned with salt and pepper, and add whatever vegetables you had: carrots, potatoes, maybe a handful of turnips, herbs from the backyard, or dried ones from a jar that had sat in the cupboard for years. And then you waited, not 5 minutes, not 10. You let it cook low and slow for hours until the meat softened, not just cooked, but transformed, because beef heart was lean, sure, but it was also strong. You couldn't rush it. You had to earn it. But when it gave in, when it surrendered to the broth and the flame and the patient stirring of someone who knew what they were doing, it became tender in a way that was almost shocking. The stew thickened. The flavors deepened, and when it was ladled into bowls, steaming, fragrant, hearty, you didn't ask questions. You just ate, and you felt full in a way that had nothing to do with calories. This was food that reminded you where you came from, that nothing should be wasted, that every part of the animal had value, that working-class kitchens were built not on excess, but on reverence for labor, for life, for nourishment earned the hard way. Kids didn't always know what they were eating. They just knew it was good, that it tasted like Sunday, like being safe, like coming home from school and smelling something familiar before you even opened the door. Today, beef heart is pushed to the edges of meat counters if it's sold at all. It's labeled awful, dismissed by people who've never known real hunger, never watched a parent stretch a single cut of meat into 2 nights of dinners and a week's worth of leftovers. But for the people who remember, who grew up on Depression-era meals, on war rations, on the teachings of parents who knew the weight of waste, beef heart stew wasn't just a dish. It was a statement, a lesson that even the hardest things, with time and care, could be made soft. That toughness, when cooked with love, could turn into something that filled your stomach and stayed in your soul. Rice and raisin casserole, the sweet you shared. When sugar was scarce, it didn't shimmer, it didn't rise, it didn't have icing or frosting or sprinkles, but it had something else, something softer, something older. The rice and raisin casserole was never meant to dazzle, it was meant to soothe. A warm hug on a hard day, a quiet yes when the rest of the world said no. This was dessert born from leftovers and longing, from a spoonful of rice that wasn't enough for a full plate but too sacred to throw away, from a handful of raisins rattling in a tin at the back of the cupboard, from a mother or grandmother standing over the stove with tired feet, wondering how to turn not enough into just enough. You started with rice, cooked fresh or saved from last night's dinner. White rice, plain and soft. It didn't need to be fancy, it just needed to be there. The raisins came next, soaked sometimes in warm water or milk to plump them up. And then you'd make the custard, milk, eggs, sugar, and a whisper of vanilla or nutmeg if your pantry allowed. Everything was folded together gently, like it might break under pressure, then poured into a buttered baking dish, usually chipped at the edges, the kind that had served every family meal for 20 years. You'd place it in the oven and wait, not just for it to bake, but for the house to change. Because once the scent began to rise, sweet milk, soft rice, warming sugar, it filled the air with something no store-bought dessert ever could: peace. The top would brown just slightly, forming a delicate crust. The inside stayed soft, like pudding, like memory. You served it warm, always warm, with a splash of cream if there was any left, or just on its own, spooned into chipped bowls, steam curling into the air like a sigh of relief. This wasn't a dessert for celebration, it was a dessert for consolation, for after funerals, after layoffs, after long, aching winters. It was the kind of food you made when you couldn't afford joy, so you crafted comfort instead. Kids didn't clamor for it. They didn't ask for seconds the way they did with pie, but years later, they remembered. They remembered the quiet clink of the spoon in the casserole dish, the way the raisins sank like hidden treasure, the stillness of the kitchen when the only light came from the oven and the only sound was someone softly stirring. This dish didn't travel. You didn't bring it to potlucks or serve it at birthdays. It lived inside the walls of your own home, behind the stories nobody told and the strength nobody praised. Today, you'll find rice pudding in plastic cups at the supermarket, pre-packaged, flavored, shelf-stable, but it's not the same. It doesn't carry the hush of hardship or the softness of survival. It doesn't taste like your mother's hands or the silence she kept while stirring. Because rice and raisin casserole wasn't just dessert, it was a reply to the world when the world was unkind, a way of saying, we still have warmth, we still have sweetness, we still have each other. Even if all we have left is rice, raisins, and a little bit of faith. Mock chicken legs, the trick that fooled no one, but fed everyone. It looked like chicken, sort of, if you squinted, if you tilted your head just right. It sat there on your plate with a breadcrumb crust and a popsicle stick jammed through the bottom like a handle, standing proud, like it had something to prove, and in a way, it did. Mock chicken legs were Depression-era sleight of hand. a culinary illusion crafted by mothers and grandmothers who understood two things better than anyone: how to stretch a dollar and how to protect a child's hope from the weight of reality. There was no chicken breast in this dish, no fancy cuts, sometimes no chicken at all. Instead, you started with scraps: ground pork, leftover chicken if you had it, maybe some veal, or even just a hunk of liver that had been boiled soft and minced fine. You'd season it with salt, pepper, maybe some sage or onion powder. Mix it all together in a bowl with day-old breadcrumbs and a splash of milk. Then came the shaping. With damp hands, you'd mold the meat mixture into the shape of a drumstick. Not perfect, but convincing enough for a child with an imagination and a growling belly. You'd slide a wooden stick inside, sometimes a real skewer, sometimes just a splintered tongue depressor from the medicine cabinet, and roll the whole thing in beaten egg, then breadcrumbs. Into the frying pan it went. The oil sizzled, the smell was rich, familiar. Golden crust formed on the outside while the inside turned soft and steamy. When you served them, 2 per plate, maybe with mashed potatoes or boiled carrots, they almost passed for the real thing. And when your kids asked, "Is this chicken?" you'd smile and say, "Close enough." It wasn't about fooling them, not really. It was about giving them the feeling of having something special, something like what the neighbors had, something they could talk about at school without shame. Because food, back then, wasn't just nutrition, it was armor, it was dignity, it was love shaped into drumsticks and fried until golden. Mock chicken legs weren't reserved for Sunday dinner or company. They were Tuesday food, rainy day food. We're out of money, but we're not out of ideas food. They were a mother's way of saying, "I see you, I know what you're missing, and I'm going to make something out of nothing just for you." And somehow they worked. You'd pick them up by the stick, bite through the crust, and hit that soft, savory center, rich, salty, a little peppery. You knew it wasn't chicken, but you didn't care, because it tasted like home, like trying, like effort made visible on a plate. These cookies didn't come in plastic packaging. They came from tired hands and quiet afternoons. They were made by women who remembered war rationing, who knew what it meant to stretch ingredients and still put something special on the table. And if you were lucky enough to get the last one in the tin, you felt like royalty. Today, raisin-filled cookies are nearly extinct. You won't find them in bakeries or supermarkets, maybe in a faded church cookbook, maybe scribbled on a yellowing index card tucked behind the spice jars. But if you remember them, you don't just remember a snack, you remember the whole kitchen, the smell, the quiet, the feeling of being cared for, because some recipes weren't just about flavor. They were about time, about effort, about someone saying, without saying a word, "You're worth it."